So I was looking at Twitter and I saw there was an explosion at the Vector Institute in Novosibirsk, Siberia, in Russia. And I guess people were concerned because it's a biological laboratory, I guess, which apparently could contain some nasty stuff. I got into sort of a discussion, and it reminded me of the St. Louis experiments. So, like I said, this occurred in Novosibirsk, Russia, kind of near a place that's called Akademgorodok, which translates to scientific city, basically, or academic city. That was the site of, the top Soviet military intelligentsia, scientists, bomb designers, and biological weapons research, and all of that sort of thing. And this is at the Vector Lab. Apparently, that's the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology, which it says on Wikipedia is kind of like their CDC, basically, and biological hazard levels 1 through 4. Biological hazard 4, level 4 is the worst. That's like Ebola, smallpox, and apparently this place also has one of the last samples in the world of smallpox, which is why people were freaking out. Nothing's going to happen. It is like the CDC. This is where they designed all the Soviet biological weapons. They know what they're doing. They've got level 4. They've got some high-tech stuff. There's no way anything's getting out of there. So people should just chill out on that one. But it reminded me of the St. Louis experiments because that was a major cause of the U.S. Army, quote-unquote, which was really the CIA, doing the experiments in St. Louis, releasing various biological material as well as inert dust, so-called, that fluoresced under black light and also had a radioactive component of a single radium atom per particle, so it could also be tracked by Geiger counter. And it's very interesting. Most of this has been declassified. A lot of the stuff, I think, in the later time, the stuff from the 50s and 60s is mostly declassified, but people should realize that it continued into the 70s and possibly the 80s, at least the 70s for sure. Don't know about the 80s, but I'm pretty sure that the radium labeled nanoparticles, sub 20 micron nanoparticles, is what you need for these experiments in order to mimic the way that weaponized biological agents will blow around in the wind and so forth. So what you're trying to do with the test particle is, one, you want it to be as inert and non-harming to anything as possible, also because you don't want to be discovered by anybody who's not looking for it specifically. You don't want it to be easy to find unless you're specifically looking for that thing in order to do tests like this and keep them secret, of course. So the particles had to be a certain size, and in order to track them, there were two methods, which was fluorescence. The particles would fluoresce under black light, so you could see it with a black light, which, again, back then was very uncommon. You didn't just go to the Spencer gift store and buy a black light or something like that. Nobody had them, besides, let's say, the military or, high-tech science sort of thing, ultraviolet lights and so forth. People didn't have those things commonly. Maybe in the 70s they did. But these were also public housing projects anyways. And then the secondary method was to use a Geiger counter, something else regular people wouldn't have. And that was by radio tagging each particle, sub 20 micron particle, with a single radium atom. One atom of radium, in order to be able to track the dust via Geiger counter accurately, to know how much dust is in a specific area with a Geiger counter, because each particle has one radium atom, and so you know how many particles there are based on the Geiger counter reading wherever you go, and that's how they tracked it, with UV lights and Geiger counters. And they didn't just dump this stuff off of rooftops and spray it out of planes over the city. They didn't just do that sort of thing. They also went inside the buildings and spread it in there to see how it would spread inside large apartment blocks, which again were government run and it's government property, and so that's where they were doing it. I think the estimated casualty prediction was something like 2 to 3 people potentially dying of cancer because of the extra radium in the environment producing extra decay radiation. So let's say maybe between 0 and 10 people possibly could have died eventually from a cancer that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten. But again, this is the government doing experiments on American citizens without their knowledge, involving nuclear radiation in dust that the government is putting in their homes, and that's pretty crazy. That's a bad thing to do. So how did they justify it to themselves? Why did they do it? Because of this place right here in Russia, in Novosibirsk, in Akademgorodok. Because of that place. We didn't know that Akademgorodok existed until the wall came down. We didn't know about it. The CIA didn't know about it. All of the nuclear scientists, all of the main scientists in Russia, they were there. Novosibirsk is in the middle of nowhere in Siberia. The story is that the Soviets had developed a weaponized Ebola virus with a lethality rate above 90% that could survive the radiation of a nuclear battlefield, which is to say it could be dropped after a nuclear detonation and survive the radioactive environment in order to infect people and kill them, which is to say to kill all of the survivors. At the time, these were city killers. The Soviets didn't have very accurate missiles. They never had as accurate missiles as we had, and so they had to use bigger bombs. The Soviets had to use bigger bombs because their missiles weren't accurate enough, and so these were called city killers. I believe at one point the Soviets were deploying something like 40 megaton bombs as city killers at one point. As the accuracy of their ballistic missiles got better, then they also reduced the sizes, the megaton sizes of their bombs, and the city killers at this point have pretty much gone away in all modern nuclear militaries. But at the time, it was like that movie The Day After from the 80s. By the 80s, the city killer bombs were pretty much being phased out, but the Soviets still had them. I think so did we, a few at least. So that movie could be actually very accurate for the time of city killer nuclear weapons. And so at that time, they were basically going to use a city killer bomb or 2 or 3, 40 megaton, 20 megatons, and then to kill all the survivors, drop this radiation-resistant weaponized Ebola virus. That's, I think, what triggered the St. Louis experiments to either be reinstated or continued. At least that was the excuse given for the 1970s version of it, or the continuation of it. That I don't know. But so that's how this stuff is rationalized. The Soviets have weaponized radiation-resistant Ebola virus that they're going to use to kill 90% of all survivors of their city killer bombs. We have to do something. Well, we can do these experiments using an inert powder that shouldn't hurt anybody. It fluoresces under black light. We can track it, and we'll add a single radium atom to each one. Oh, well, what's the probability that this will hurt somebody? Well, somebody might die, 0 to 3 people, within the next 20 years or 30 or 40 years in their lifespan of a cancer that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten. Well, when it's potentially hundreds of millions of American lives, and the Soviets have a plan to wipe out all survivors after a city killer thermonuclear attack, 3 people possibly getting cancer in the future doesn't sound all that bad. And so this is how these things actually happen. This is what that facility, that vector facility, was, at least during the Cold War, and basically still is if it's still their smallpox storage facility. This is their main facility for biological, and it's in Akademgorodok. And it's the same facility that developed the radiation-resistant Ebola virus. But don't worry, it is safe in terms of getting out. It's not getting out. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a good one. Try not to get weaponized Ebola.